Good morning. I'm Jennifer Brown. I'm the Dean of Quinnipiac Law School, and it is my pleasure on behalf of the Law School, the Center on Dispute Resolution, and the Albert Schweitzer Institute to welcome you this morning to this symposium, Dialogues of Transitional Justice. This symposium is really braiding together three important strands of teaching, scholarship, and practice here at Quinnipiac. First, the Albert Schweitzer Institute, which is committed to introducing Albert Schweitzer's philosophy of reverence for life to a broader audience in order to bring about a more civil and ethical human society that's characterized by respect, responsibility, compassion, and service. One of the ways that ASI does this is by organizing delegations of students, faculty, and practitioners to travel abroad in learning and service. And probably there are people in this room who have gone to Guatemala or Nicaragua on trips that have been organized by ASI. So we've really benefited from the work that the Institute has done. And we're very grateful to ASI's involvement in this symposium. David Ives, the director of the Institute, had a family emergency and was unable to join us today, but I know he sends his greetings, and we want to express our thanks to him for helping to organize this. And we also thank Anat Biletzki for your involvement on behalf of the ASI. Thank you. A second strand in the braid that I referred to earlier is our Center on Dispute Resolution here at Quinnipiac, which was founded more than 15 years ago to bring theory to practice and also practice to theory, right, to enrich the field of dispute resolution. And the center is being ably led by Carolyn Cass and Charlie Pillsbury with the assistance of Kristen Sweet, and they were all instrumental in organizing this conference. So we're very thankful to the Center on Dispute Resolution. And the third strand, of course, is our own law review. And the wonderful students who lead and run that organization. I'm going to name a few, but I know that many more of you were active in organizing this conference and are going to be working today to pull it off. Sarah Gruber and Diane Cooper, they have put together a great day for us. And I think you'll see over the course of the day the passion and professionalism that Quinnipiac students bring to the work they do, as our students are going to be actively participating in the panels and in the discussion. And finally, I want to thank my colleague Linda Meyer, and her research, Kelsey Craveiro. Where's Kelsey? Somewhere. There's Kelsey. Thank you all, because they really began the conversation that gave rise to this symposium. And I'm particularly grateful to Linda, who lends her talents so generously to our community. And I think she sort of embodies this wonderful kind of paradox that she's both fierce and gentle, which may be a really good metaphor for our day here in talking about transitional justice. So that's what we're here today to talk about. Transitional justice that isn't a sort of special kind of justice, but more a philosophy, and it's an approach to achieving justice in times of transition away from conflict and away from civil or state oppression and repression. Transitional justice strives to achieve accountability for wrongdoers and redress for victims. And in that way, transitional justice provides a recognition of the rights of victims, it promotes civic trust, it strengthens the democratic rule of law. Transitional justice flows from restorative justice theory, which is a victim-centered response to crime, that it gives the people who are most directly affected by the criminal act, the victim, the offender, their families, and representatives from the community, the opportunity to be directly involved in responding to the harm that's been caused by the crime. Howard Zehr, who's been a leader of the restorative justice movement in North America, lays out the principles, the questions, the concepts of restorative justice quite clearly. And so I want to run through those because I think they may provide a kind of a structure or a set of questions that could drive our thoughts today. So to begin with, a core principle of restorative justice theory is that crime is not just breaking a rule, right? It's actually a violation of people and of interpersonal relationships. And because that is what crime is, restorative justice asks, first, who has been hurt? Who has been hurt? And this reflects a concern for the victims and their needs. A second core principle of restorative justice theory is that these violations create obligations. And so restorative justice looks at those who have been hurt and asks, what are their needs? And that creates accountability for offenders. It encourages them to understand the nature and consequences of the harm they've caused and take responsibility for them to make things right. Thirdly, a core principle of restorative justice theory is because our central obligation is to put things right, to right these wrongs, restorative justice looks at the needs of those who've been hurt and asks this final question, whose obligations are these? And that question can cause restorative justice to look quite different from retributive justice and other forms of criminal practice and process that we often see. So this leads to participation. It leads to participation by a broad range of stakeholders who include victims, offenders, communities of care. It involves all of them to get the information they need to answer these three key questions. Who has been hurt? What are their needs? And whose obligations are these? And to try to answer those questions in creative, constructive ways. And they all participate in the decision that answers those questions. So I hope we'll kind of bear in mind these questions over the course of the day. And I really encourage the students here at Quinnipiac to bear those questions in mind, no matter what area of law you go into. When you're dealing with a breached contract, when you're dealing with a tort that has happened, an accident, an injury, when you're working in criminal law, to ask who's been harmed by this breach of duty, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these? Because that's the kind of problem-solving lawyering that we're trying to nurture here at Quinnipiac. And I believe that's the way that each of our law students, in his or her own way, can bring some healing to the world. And so we're happy to take on that challenge. And again, I welcome you here today, so thank you.
I would like to add my welcome as well. I'm Carolyn Cass. I am the co-director of the Center on Dispute Resolution. And a note to my students, you'll probably find this as hilarious as I do, but they've put me in charge of timekeeping today. But we are going to stay on time today. We're a little behind, but we will use our breaks, and that one wasn't my fault. We will use our breaks and our lunch to catch up, and we may go into our final. If you've looked at the schedule, we have some time at the end for discussion and question and answers. We will still end at 4 o'clock, and we will give all of our speakers all their time. I just want to just run through the format before I bring our first speaker up, just so you all know what's going to happen. We will have 25 to 30 minutes of commentary by our main speakers. Then we will invite are 2 or 3 commentary providers up. I'll introduce them. They will sit here with our speaker. They will add some of their notes and comments, and we should still have some time for communication with the audience, questions and answers at the end of each hour. And if we do not get to all the questions during that hour, we won't stay on that topic. What we'll do is ask those of you who haven't had a chance to ask your comments, jot them down, and we'll bring them to the end part of our day so that everyone will have a chance to have the discussion they want to have, and we'll be able to stay on track. So, I also, though, want to bring the greetings of Charlie Pillsbury. As Jen Brown said, he is our co-director here, and he is the executive director of Mediators Beyond Borders. And nothing got him more excited than to think about being here at this program, and then his granddaughter has to go be baptized today on the other side of the country. So he sends his greetings from afar and wishes us a very good day. So we will kick off the day, only a few minutes behind. And so what I'm going to do now is introduce very briefly our first speaker, Anat Biletzki. Let me just say at the outset, you have everyone's full bios, so I will not read their bios, but I will bring out a few highlights. So Professor Anat Biletzki is the Albert Schweitzer Professor of Philosophy here at Quinnipiac. She was the Professor of Philosophy at Tel Aviv since 1979, Tel Aviv University prior to that. She was chairperson of the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories and was nominated among the 1,000 women for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. She will be presenting kicking us off today with presenting on remembrance and acknowledgement as necessary conditions of reconciliation. So Professor Biletzki, and then, as we said, the commentators will come up later, but with no further ado.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I've been here before, but not with so many law people around. And I do thank Linda for inviting me, and the whole committee, actually, because I am not a legal scholar. I come from philosophy on the one hand and activism on the other, and I'll try to be as legally precise as possible, but I will be happy to hear corrections and emendations. I'm starting with one small quote from a blog that we had in Tel Aviv during the 2011 Occupy Wall Street, which in Israel was Occupy Rothschild Boulevard. And the blog, this was a Palestinian who wrote, "Justice brings peace, not the other way around." Right? And I thank you for giving me half of my paper in the way you talked about transitional justice. You said away from conflict. And my problem will be what to do when you are right in the middle of conflict. Okay, so one's ruminations, even if they are submissions of theoretical or conceptual deliberation, are born of a time and place, and my thoughts arise in and from a place, Israel-Palestine, and in these current dire times. Not that I remember them ever being different, but they are now dire. And the aim of my exercise is to broach the issue of reconciliation, but I will be calling it conciliation, not always reconciliation, and using the experience, the insights, and the convolutions that go with a time and a place to submit a more nuanced, I hope, reading of what reconciliation is, what it can be, and what it should be. When I say what it should be, I'm talking about a normative talk rather than a descriptive talk, but as you'll see, what I will be doing is describing a time and a place rather than prescribing what we should do. Now, the conventional wisdom we've just gone through, so you've really saved me a part of my paper. This is good. But the conventional wisdom says first war, violent conflict, then cessation of hostilities, a certain cessation of hostilities. Sometimes we call it a ceasefire, sometimes truce, sometimes armistice. I see Nir here, who's taught me a lot about armistice and truce. And then a somewhat peace, a transitional period during which warring parties aspire to arrive at justice In other words, to make the peace a just peace. That's the transition, moving from peace to just peace. Sometimes posited as attainment of democracy, sometimes other types of terminology. So successful transitional justice may lead to varying degrees of a just peace, but the conventional assumption that accompanies this conventional wisdom says that during the time of war, during violent conflict, there are no normal, explicit manifestations of peaceable relational coexistence between the parties. It's always after war. It's always in post-conflict time, during a period that aspires perhaps to peace, though not yet a just peace, that reconciliation makes its entrance. Indeed, the way that the tale of transitional justice is recounted, it's usually up to reconciliation to ensure that we get to just peace from just peace. That sounded bad, okay? From peace to just peace through reconciliation. So in a sense, reconciliation is considered a necessary condition of just peace, and in that same sense, it has to precede the ultimate endpoint by a temporal, procedural, or sometimes a formal hair split. There's a presupposition at work here then. Reconciliation can only manifest itself after violent conflict has been put to rest, in the wake of conflict. And I wish I could tell you how many times I saw that word wake. Just reading this for today, or any time I look into any site, any book, anybody talking about transitional justice, it's always in the wake of conflict. And what I put on offer here is just a different timeline. More significantly, what I attempt to sidestep are questions of time as a necessity in the investigation of genuine reconciliation. Now, initially, this is counterintuitive. What I am entertaining here is the proposal, and I'll tell a story as evidence of that proposal, that reconciliation, though relevant to a fully realized just peace, is not dependent on the cessation of violence. In fact, reconciliation does not need to wait for even a semblance of peace, a quiet on the front, a truce, a ceasefire, peace negotiations, treaties, any of those things that we all know that we go through. What I'm saying is that reconciliation might be instead a necessary step in the ending of war itself. So that is my thesis, hypothesis, the story I want to tell of how you must go into a certain reconciliation before peace rather than after peace. Now, the reconciliation that I am addressing here is political reconciliation. And in that theory of transitional justice, not to mention the theories of negotiations and peacemaking, et cetera, there are all sorts of categorizations. The political conflict that I will be talking about is a political conflict, and the reconciliation I'm talking about is political reconciliation. I need to make a few preliminary clarifications that are almost semantic. One, of course, as we just mentioned, is the question of reconciliation versus conciliation. By saying reconciliation, we assume an earlier togetherness before the onset of violence, which is to be reconstituted after cessation of conflict. I'm using the term more loosely, and I'm not the first one making this up. In other words, you reconcile even though you might not have been reconciled to begin with. And there's wonderful research being done now in the case that I will be talking about, Israel-Palestine, about whether there was conciliation before conflict. It depends on the historical stories we tell, and you will choose, according to the story I decide to tell, whether you think there was conciliation before. But that is not going to be relevant to my talk of reconciliation. You can call it always conciliation rather than reconciliation. That's the first point. Secondly, in contrast to several models of political reconciliation that focus on ritual or apology, or indeed the ritual itself of apology, my investigation is invigorated primarily by a cognitive view of reconciliation rather than any procedural or performative one. So again, I'm not saying there is no ritual, there is no apology. I'm just saying this is not a part of my analysis. I'm talking about cognitive reconciliation, maybe even emotional reconciliation, but not anything that is dependent on a performative or a specific ritual. Another element to be elucidated is the relative status of the parties to be reconciled. And I will get to this in much more detail in the ensuing analysis, but there's no a priori demand concerning the parity of social, political, or economic status or behavior, or for that matter, their absence between the factions. The two sides reconciliating do not necessarily have to be equal, do not necessarily have to be unequal. We talk of apology, of forgiveness, et cetera, between parents and children. Of course, no equality there. We do usually talk in political cases of a preferred parity. I am not a priori assuming any type of relational status. And finally, genuine personal reconciliation has often been conceptually analyzed as essentially involving forgiveness. I am not talking here of forgiveness, even though this comes up so often in the literature and definitely in the experiences we have had of reconciliation. Reconciling in our sense means undergoing processes of change of heart and mind with and vis-a-vis an other. This may consist of forgiveness, but doesn't inevitably do so. Certainly one and perhaps a group can find oneself at a certain stage of reconciliation without yet having forgiven or been forgiven. An essential replacement for forgiveness is something that I will be suggesting here, and I can, since it's in the title, I can give it away right away. I'm talking of acknowledgement as much more important than forgiveness. All right, so my main term here will be acknowledgement. Okay, that is all background. I want to dive into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is the engine of that particular story of reconciliation? How can we talk about Israel-Palestine? My story is clearly about political reconciliation. In the analysis of political reconciliation, we hear about international conflicts, we hear about civil conflicts, we hear about colonials and the colonized. Those are basically the three types of conflicts that we encounter when we talk about political conflicts. And when you hear about, or when you read about Israel-Palestine, you'll find all three of those. You'll find people talking about it as an international conflict. Two nations, international. You'll find people talking about a civil or internal to one society conflict. You then look differently at Israelis, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians as part of one society, and you find more and more in the past few decades talk of colonial conflict going on here. Some type of colonial behavior or history that is now either over or being reenacted. I am not going into the question, which of these is it, but I am insisting that this is political reconciliation rather than personal reconciliation, and that will be very important. By the way, this is just my weakness. When I do philosophy of language, I always ask about names, and if you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I've called it here Israel-Palestine conflict, but if you think about it, it is sometimes presented as the Arab-Israeli problem, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Jewish-Muslim clash, the Jewish-Palestinian war, the Zionist-Palestinian conflict. Think of all these different names. Each one of them is basically giving away, with its name, the theoretical underpinning of the conflict, whether you think it is two nations, two religions, a conqueror and an occupied, or whatever. All that comes through in the names. I will be saying Israel-Palestine, but that's only because it makes it easier, and that is the most conventional. I do not specifically adhere to that being an international between two nations. So we will get to that. But our decision as to what kind of political conflict it is then leads to different dates when we tell the history. So the beginning of the conflict might be at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of Zionism. It might be 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. It might be 1967, the beginning of that particular occupation of Palestinian lands in 1967. These are different stories to be told, again, according to how one characterizes the conflict. In that sense, there have been 44 or 63 or over 100 years of conflict between Zionists and Palestinians. There have been wars, bloodletting, killings, suicide bombings, regular bombings, targeted assassinations, terrorist activities, invasions, and sieges. These are the words that I come with easily. I am sure you can think of some more. There have been periods of intense physical violence, and there have been periods of what is termed in Israel low-scale violence. There have been wars, usually marked by a beginning and an end date. There have been uprisings and invasions, and there have been periods of calm, some of them touted as bespeaking a peace process, but never as peace. Since there has been continuous oppression and continuous occupation, it is reasonable, I feel, to opine that the conflict has been with us for decades, not ever really letting up or reaching anything akin to a period of even transitional peace. So that is my more factual hypothesis rather than the theoretical one that I spoke of before. The proposition on offer here is that lack of any progress that would lead to a long-lasting truce, treaty, period of transitional peace, or, of course, a semblance of real just peace, is the result of no real moves being made towards reconciliation. In other words, I am turning the cart and saying the reason we haven't gotten to any initial peace that might lead to transitional justice is that we have not talked about reconciliation during these periods of war. It's my further thesis that such reconciliation requires a number of elements that have rarely been promoted during 63 years of the State of Israel. So I am telling my story from 1948. Is it 63? It's 65, sorry. 65 years. Okay. Without elements of reconciliation pursued or attained during the conflict, any gestures of tentative peace are either spurious or, even if naively construed, even if authentic, doomed to fail. Now, it's imperative for me to clarify, this is an investigation of moments of reconciliation that are necessary for the begetting of peace. Remarkably, in specific conflicts, South Africa, for instance, some of the points that I will be talking about were reached in public and global consciousness while the conflict was still raging. But I submit that since none of these has surfaced in any substantial form, and that in fact they're all vehemently and consensually denied in Israel, it has proven impossible to even begin to consideration a germination of peace. Now, I will have three functions that go with my reconciliation. One is recognition of asymmetry. One is identification of victimhood, where you said who suffered. And the third is the narrative of acknowledgement. What I am saying is that none of these was seriously entertained in Israel. And especially that third one, narrative of acknowledgement, is a sine qua non of reconciliation during or post-conflict. This last is seductive and paradoxical precisely in that it doesn't require peace for its embodiment. Okay, so what are the elements of reconciliation that have to emerge during conflict, or at least during the conflict that I'm talking about? First, recognition of asymmetry. The semantics of several or most terms in our repertoire of war and peace, especially the words war, conflict, and compromise, of course, presuppose symmetry between the warring sides. Such has been the lot of political common wisdom on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, positing two sides, each guilty of wrongdoings, each victimized by the other, each needing to compromise. Everybody's always talking about compromise, Obama down. And both equally culpable for the creation and subsistence of the conflict. I question this conventional wisdom. Since the diagnostics of a wrongdoing is a necessary point of analysis in any reconciliation, assessing the relationship between conflicted parties correctly as symmetrical or asymmetrical is mandatory for the reconciliation to be a true reconciliation. The bon ton of contemporary peace discourse invigorates all the factors leaning towards symmetry. Clearly, it's manifest that both sides have perceptions of wrongs having been done to them. Additionally, contemporary political fashion embraces the idea of third parties as unbiased mediators. We always talk about unbiased mediators, showing no partiality to either side of the conflict. On the whole, political audiences, as opposed to political players, are more amenable to there are two sides to every story. Everyone is always neutral, unbiased, and there are two sides to every story. In spite of this general proclivity for symmetry, it is critical for the purpose of a bona fide reconciliation to arrive at the cognizance that in a particular story, in particular my particular story, the descriptive, but no less essential for that truth, might be one of asymmetry. One side may be more in the wrong than the other. One side may have suffered more profusely than the other. One side violated the rights of the other more grievously. One side was more a victim than the other. And this brings us exactly to the question, who was the victim? All right, so first there is recognition of asymmetry, and then there is the question of who has been hurt, who is the victim. In the case of Israel-Palestine, it's abundantly clear that both Jews and Palestinians as individuals have been wronged by individuals of the other group. In other words, everybody has been a victim. But the pertinent question before us concerns the victimhood of a whole group. We're talking about political reconciliation, not personal victimhood. And here we come across an interesting variation within the common discourse of reconciliation. Jews justly professed a victimhood of 2,000 years to a history of anti-Semitism and to the ultimate victimhood, bar none, during the Holocaust. Indeed, it's a universally accepted platitude, but no less correct for that the State of Israel was established, it was voted on by the United Nations General Assembly and legitimized by the global community as a result of the genocide perpetrated against the Jews in the Holocaust. Palestinians, on their part, point to a victimhood of a little over a century since the establishment of the political movement of Zionism in the late 19th century, to a history of Zionist colonization, and to their ultimate victimhood in the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1947-48, when 2/3 of the indigenous Palestinians living on their land in Palestine were expelled from their homes to become refugees in a grand operation of ethnic cleansing that many claim has been going on ever since. Now, engaging with reconciliation involves recognition of the other side's suffering, that is, the other side's victimhood. And without that, one can't really talk about reconciliation without recognizing the other side. But when you think about Israel-Palestine, you can't help but notice the strangeness of the supposed symmetry in the Israeli-Palestinian case. Both peoples are victims with a history and evidence to buttress their respective claims of victimhood. But the Jews are victims of history, anti-Semitism, and the Germans. The Palestinians are victims of the Jews. Lacking the symmetry of the victimizer-victim relationship between Jews and Palestinians, it is incongruous to posit equal victimhood for them. Grosso modo, and again, contrary to conventional wisdom, although there are recognizable particular cases of individual victimizers and victims on both sides, there is group victimhood, political victimhood, on one side only. All right, and I now get to the last necessary condition of reconciliation, after which I will tell a short story about one movement that is engaging in that. I'm talking about acknowledgement, or a narrative of acknowledgement. The narrative that challenges us is the Jewish narrative rather than the Palestinian one. In other words, and again in contradistinction to the conventional approach, this thesis doesn't call for mutual recognition by both sides to a conflict of the other side's narrative. It rather makes a new strident demand on one side's narrative. In telling the story of victimhood, Jews point to history and anti-Semitism. This part of Jewish-Israeli identity carries forward with stupendous consistency into the story of the establishment of the State of Israel. And I don't have time now to tell that whole story. I think it is the story that most people, definitely in America, have heard. So I am not going to rehearse it now, only to say that Israel sees itself as having been on the defensive against millions of Arabs attacking during the 1948 War of Independence. Astoundingly, nowhere do Palestinians, the indigenous people of the land, figure in the conventional Israeli story. Or if they're present in the tale, they're depicted as hapless locals who were enticed to leave by other Arab states with promises of victorious return to their homes or lands after the war. Nowhere is mention made in the Israeli narrative of hundreds of villages devastated, demolished, desecrated, hundreds of thousands of people driven out to refugee existence of over 60 years that has burgeoned into one of the world's longest and greatest refugee crises. It's interesting to note, by the way, that there are historians who do tell a different story, but they're the professionals. In fact, they're mostly Israeli historians. They are called the new historians. They tell a very different tale. But it's interesting that that professional history has never become the received narrative. And the question is, how can a different historical story become a deeper acknowledgement of one side, of the victimizer side rather than the victimhood side? In order to tell that story, I want to tell of one organization called Zochrot. Do we want to show the pictures or not? Okay. These are just going to go on here in the back. I want to make the point that every single one of these pictures is on the website of the organization that I'm telling about. All right? So you'll just get a feeling of the organization. I think that this is the only instance of true acknowledgement. Not that there haven't been other groups that say, yes, there was a Nakba, yes, there was a Palestinian catastrophe, but this is the one group that has made acknowledgement its goal. And the name of the organization is Zochrot. The name in Hebrew immediately raises eyebrows. Translated into English, it means remembering, and you will see a lot of remembering there in the English. By the way, Zochrot in Hebrew is feminine and plural. It means we, the women, remember. It could be you, the women, it could be they, the women, but it is feminine and plural, which makes it strange as the name of an organization. But no more explicit acknowledgement is imaginable. We, as women, remember the Nakba. The female voice is significant, as is a strange use of a verb to serve as a proper name of an organization. That female voice was intentionally adopted by the founders of the organization to claim a distance from the masculine forms of language that, they say, are so characteristic of Zionist discourse, which they view as, quote, violent and nationalistic. So we, the women, are not violent and not nationalistic when we remember. There's something odd, even disorienting, in naming an organization not by a proper name, but by the active voice of their actions, remembering. Remembrance as a point of memory alone, as a cognitive or even emotive condition, is merely for the organization a small first step in talk of conciliation. The transition from dire conflict to peace before peace be done demands that the remembrance be, rather than passive memory, an active remembrance. Active in the sense of acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement, to be authentic acknowledgement in the case of acknowledgement of wrongdoing, must involve accountability, and the final step from remembrance to acknowledgement to accountability leads to conciliation that can only come about in the form of political restitution. I think you talked about restorative. They talk about restitution. On the webpage of the organization, under the Who Are We, or Who We Are, the organization spells out its vision, and I quote, return of the Palestinian refugees to their country on the basis of acknowledgement and accountability. Acknowledgement and accountability, those are the two words that are the vision, coupled with a joint Jewish-Palestinian process of restitution founded on the principles of transitional justice. So this is an organization that says we are doing transitional justice in the middle of conflict, right there in the area and in the times of conflict. Now that's a vision, and it's a far-off vision indeed. Return, they talk about return of refugees, but this can only happen after or on the basis of acknowledgement and accountability. Still on that same webpage, after the vision, there is an overarching goal, quote, to realize its vision, Zochrot will act to promote Israeli Jewish society's acknowledgement of and accountability for the ongoing injustices of the Nakba and the reconceptualization of return as the imperative redress of the Nakba. I'm here in America saying this now, but you can't imagine how radical that sounds to Israeli Jewish ears. The goal, that is to get Israeli Jewish society to acknowledge and be accountable for the Nakba. No symmetry here, no demand, as we so often hear, of the Palestinians to acknowledge any wrongdoing on their part or of both sides, to the compromise, or any such conventional empty mantras. And finally, there is a purpose. Again, I quote, Zochrot will act to challenge the Israeli Jewish public's preconceptions and promote awareness, political and cultural change within it, to create the conditions for the return of the Palestinian refugees and a shared life in this country. I'm continuing their own quote. To do so, Zochrot will generate processes in which Israeli Jews will reflect on and review their identity, history, future, and the resulting discourse through which they conceive of their lives in this country. Our focus on the Jewish target audience derives from its practical and moral responsibility for Palestinian refugeehood, as well as from its privileged power position under the present regime. That's the end of the quote, and I am nearing the end. Zochrot was established in 2002, the height of the Second Intifada, the most acute of conflictual times in Israeli-Palestinian history, barring, or I don't know, not barring the official wars. One could say indeed that more in times of official formal wars between armies of official formal states, the Second Intifada epitomizes the situation of two societies in hostile, belligerent, horrendous clash. It is in that time, during that time, not after the making of peace, but rather in a time when peace seems almost inconceivable, that a project of conciliation such as Zochrot was born. The organization, made up of Israelis, both Jewish and Palestinians, both men and women, very young people, very old people, I mean, it is the most diverse organization I know, has adopted the objective of remembering, and no less so of reminding, the Israeli public of the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948. Its venue, and this is some of the pictures that you're seeing, involves Palestinian villages, their inhabitants, their culture, their art, their music, their stories, their tragedies, destroyed during the Nakba. It organizes trips and tours to the villages and towns that no longer exist. So what you're seeing here are sometimes modern pictures of Israelis traveling to the villages, sometimes the old historical villages and towns as they were. And these trips are led by guides who know Hebrew and Arabic, and by inhabitants who know and remember the local history. The organization publishes articles and interviews on the Palestinian narrative of the Nakba years. It puts out booklets. What you're seeing there is a lot of front pages of those booklets about these villages and towns, telling their stories, their narratives. It holds lectures, symposia, and exhibitions on the Nakba. Poignantly, yet effectively, it hangs up road signs all over Israel, marking localities with Palestinian names long ago obliterated. And this is an ongoing fight. They hang up the signs, and the city municipalities tear them down, and we go back and we hang up the signs again, and they're torn down again. This is physical, cultural, historical, emotional acknowledgement. For Zochrot, acknowledging the past is the first step in taking responsibility for its consequences. Yes, they have a database on that webpage of all the villages that were destroyed, all their new names, and this is all in Hebrew. In one place, Zochrot say that their goal is to express the Nakba in history. Again, since I do philosophy of language, express the Nakba in history, express the Nakba in Hebrew. They are saying that we have to translate a Palestinian catastrophe into Hebrew, but this is interesting. There is a double agenda here. On the one hand, the Nakba is an alternative to the Zionist narrative, so well rooted in the Israeli Jewish psyche. More important, the Nakba, so Zachor believe, is or should be, quote, our story, the story of the Jews who live in Israel who enjoy the privilege of being the winners. So it's not, again, the regular thing that you hear, a Jewish narrative and a Palestinian narrative, but a translation of the Palestinian narrative into Hebrew so that it will be our narrative as well. Writing this Palestinian narrative in Hebrew serves a crucial purpose. Putting the data into Hebrew constitutes an establishment of facts hitherto denied by Zionist Jewish Israel. And I'd like to finish by telling of a conference that was held just this last September by Zachor. If acknowledgement is not just a passive acquiescence to information, if it entails accountability, in what way can such accountability materialize? And for Zachor, as I've already quoted, accountability means taking responsibility for deeds done, what you were talking about, responsibility that has to manifest itself in acceptance of the implications, legal or political, of those deeds. True acknowledgement of destruction of villages and towns, killings, expulsions, ethnic cleansing, obliteration of a culture, means recognizing that infamous right of return, the personal and collective right of return of the Palestinian refugees of 1948. That is, according to Zachor, the kind of acknowledgement necessary for true reconciliation. But that is also the nemesis of Jewish Israel's conception of itself as a Jewish state. No wonder, then, that when Zachor announced the conference this year on the right of return, it was called From Truth to Redress. It's not its first such conference, but this was the first one that was held in the middle of Tel Aviv, in a museum in Tel Aviv. The response of the establishment and the media was to be expected. Anything from intentional disregard to condemnation, denunciation, and even an appeal by a different organization to the Minister of Finance to cut the museum's funding. But the conference went on, and the titles of the talks in that conference is so illustrative. And here are some of the talks. Transitional Justice Responses to Palestinian Dispossession, Focus on Restitution. Transitional Justice in Israel-Palestine. Return as an act of justice. Transitioning towards full equality in return. The right of return. Reversing ethnic cleansing. Strategies and recommendations for Israeli NGOs on realizing return and promoting justice. These are just the talks that were given in the middle of Tel Aviv by Jews, Palestinians, and internationals, by the way. And the last talk was called, the second last talk was called Return Now, exclamation mark, reports from the field. The last talk was called Return Now, question mark, from political consciousness to planning the return. This last one from Eitan Bronstein, who was the founder of Zachor. Looking at this list, looking at the contents of such a conference taking place inside Israel, one is enveloped, or I am at least, in a haze of surrealism. But in a situation that shows no sign of achieving peace in any foreseeable future, one realizes that putting off reconciliation to a transitional period after some type of supposed peace, that is even less realistic. The reconciliation effected by Zachor, based on remembrance and acknowledgement, surrealistic as it may be, is the only reality predicated on justice in Israel-Palestine today. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite our three commentators to join us up front. First, we have Dr. Annabel Taylor, who is the Galpin Fellow at Quinnipiac University, but in her real life, her most of the time life, she is the senior lecturer in the Department of Social Work and Human Services at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. She will be with us in the United States. She's joined us in September and will be here through February, where she's conducting research on the use of mediation in the criminal justice system and the U.S. response to domestic violence. She will lead us off. But before she starts, let's have also Kelsey Craveiro, who's a second-year student here at the law school and is currently the research assistant for Professor Linda Meyer, a volunteer mediator at Community Mediation, and is also participating in our mediation externship. And Kate Klebes, who is also a second-year law student here pursuing our health law concentration. She is on our health law journal and is a member of Society for Dispute Resolution, also currently in the mediation externship. So we'll hear from Dr. Taylor, and then we'll hear from Kelsey and Kate, and then we will open it up.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Annabel ahau, nā mihi nui noa hau ki a koutou. My greetings to you all. People say that New Zealanders speak very fast, so I'll try to slow down. Thank you, Anat, for a most interesting and challenging contribution to understanding of aspects of peace and reconciliation, particularly in the context of Israel and Palestine. This is a conflict which we hear about in the news from time to time, like many others, but usually only in sound bites, which do not give the breadth and analysis of this piece of work. It is a courageous piece of writing in that it challenges deeply held perspectives and individual and national narratives that have been constructed in a particular socio-political time and place. I appreciate the reference to Wittgenstein and the preference to focus on particularities rather than universalisms. Nevertheless, I found myself constantly comparing and contrasting the particular portrayal with knowledge about other conflicts in order to test the proposed thesis. I'm not a philosopher, I come from social work, and Gergen's social constructivism, which allows for relative truth, which is bounded by the particular. Social constructivism also lends itself to narrative analysis, which Anat takes on towards the end of the presentation. The potential for reconciliation occurring in the absence of peace is proposed by Anat in this context. I wonder whether this is a wider phenomenon given other conflicts where attempts at reconciliation, such as by Sinn Féin in Ireland in 1987, laid the groundwork for a negotiated peace in 1995, which was then destroyed by the IRA bombing of 1996. Perhaps this illustrates the uniqueness of reconciliation processes rather than shared features, as Anat argues. Many in Northern Ireland today would argue that there is peace there without reconciliation and that it is still a deeply divided nation. Perhaps both are possible, reconciliation without peace and peace without reconciliation. I was reminded of the history of the occupation of Palestine, and I appreciated the recognition of dominant narratives. And it reminded me again that international mainstream media pay little attention to the Palestinian narrative, certainly not in our part of the world. I applauded the author's suggestion that the minority narrative must be acknowledged as a precondition of reconciliation. However, the work finishes on a more hesitant and equivocal note by suggesting that for any reconciliation to eventuate in this particular arena, that is in Israel and Palestine, that less than optimum conditions for reconciliation may be necessary as a pragmatic option given the dominant narrative. This would beg the question of a just peace, which the author cogently argues for earlier. In terms of my own research in the area of restorative justice, the work raised some questions for me. In criminal justice, who is the victim and who is the offender are legally prescribed. In New Zealand, we have restorative justice as a pre-sentence option, and from this point of view, I drew an analogy with reconciliation in the absence of peace. It's a very loose one, I'd have to say. It might explain why there is a low uptake of restorative justice processes in this pre-sentence phase, in that victims may want to see full accountability ascribed before entering into any reparative process. In other words, that someone has been punished and agreed to pay their debt. However, as Anat rightly points out, such a comparison would be a stretch, given the contrasting context and the type of dispute. Finally, Anat's account resonated with my other work on restorative justice, which is considering how restorative and reconciliation processes intersect with social justice and human rights, and my growing belief that for conciliation processes to occur, social justice principles need to parallel restorative justice principles, along with some notion of what constitutes the rights of the individuals, communities, or nations involved. Otherwise, we risk reconciliation processes that pay lip service to the very structural conditions that led to the conflict and that create a new set of grievances as a consequence. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to see all of you here on this fine Saturday morning. So, first of all, thank you, Professor Biletzki, for sharing your knowledge on this topic. I'd studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict briefly during my undergrad, but it wasn't until I read your paper that I achieved a little bit of a better understanding of the power dynamics and nuances behind this particular conflict, so thank you. So one of the things that I couldn't wrap my head around, though, was the concept of a reconciliation without apology. I think that all of us in ways are conditioned to believe that reconciliation is apology and vice versa. So what I did as I was reflecting was kind of relate that to something that I know fairly well, which is mediation. I'm a volunteer mediator at Community Mediation, which is a nonprofit in Hamden, and also Professor Meyers, research assistant here at Quinnipiac, doing research for victim-offender dialogue, which is a form of mediation. So as I began to think about reconciliation without apology in the context of mediation, I saw some pretty surprising similarities in that out of all the mediations that I've actually done or just observed, I found that the participants didn't care about apology at all. What they did care about, in fact, was recognition that there was a wrong that was committed and that perhaps one of the participants was more wronged than the other. And they also reflected a desire to move on from this, and they wanted to kind of brainstorm and figure out what was the way that they were going to be able to move on from whatever happened. So as I began to think about it a little bit more, I also began to relate peaceless reconciliation to victim-offender dialogue. VOD, as I like to call it, as its acronym, is a post-sentencing mediation in which typically the offender and the victim will meet within a prison because the offender is still incarcerated, and the facilitator, who's the mediator in that instance, will literally orient the process so the victim can take back power in that relationship, because as a result of crime, there is a gross power imbalance. So it'll be an instance where finally the victim will be able to get something off their chest and get that monkey off their back in a way that they would never be able to express within traditional criminal justice processes. So as I began to think about victim-offender dialogue within the context of peaceless reconciliation, I realized that the essential components that you outlined in your paper for peaceless reconciliation, determination of victimhood, recognition of asymmetry, and narratively based acknowledgement, that they were also essential for victim-offender dialogue. Based off of my research and my experiences in mediation, what I found is that they were astoundingly similar. There's sometimes months of prep work that go into prepping both parties for this joint session meeting within VOD. So in particular for the offender, it's imperative for the facilitator to ensure that if the offender hasn't already, they've come to some kind of understanding that there was a victim, and that although the offender may be hurting, that the victim was victimized in such a greater degree in ways that, for me, I thought were very similar to the concepts that you outlined in your paper. The same goes for narratively based acknowledgement, in that within the traditional criminal justice process, the victim is given some degree of influence within adjudication, but not in the way that would be done with victim-offender dialogue, in that it's totally different from traditional mediation in that it's supposed to be biased, and it's supposed to give that victim the ability to take back control, essentially. So I thought that that was really interesting in connecting it to narratively based acknowledgement, and that finally, in a way that is never usually done with adjudication due to posturing by the attorneys and the constitutional provision protecting against self-incrimination, that there never really is acknowledgement. It happens in rare instances, of course, but acknowledgement is something that victims need in moving forward with the crime. And VOD gives them that forum to be able to receive that acknowledgement and respond to it with that person that drastically changed their life right in front of them. So I thought that changing that narrative by giving them a forum to have some kind of acknowledgement was similar to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in that the narrative is different from the truth. The narrative in Israel is different from what happened, in that I thought it was extremely interesting, Professor Biletzki, that you talked about how within buildings that are monumented for peace within Israel, that within their scores of pamphlets and readings, that there's not a single word mentioning the occupation or Nakba, which was the catastrophe in Palestinian villages in 1948. So likewise with victim-offender dialogue, although there is some kind of influence, it's the narrative, at least for the victim, isn't their truth. So victim-offender dialogue gives them that forum to be able to transform their own narrative within themselves and receive that acknowledgement, which I think is really important. So when I brought these all together, I realized that victim-offender dialogue was extremely similar to what you talked about in your paper regarding peaceless reconciliation, and that I guess the way that I would consider it is that once a crime happens, it's not as if it's a point in time that people just move on from. Crime ripples through time, and it has repercussions that reach many people. So at the point where these two parties are engaging in VOD, in a way, the conflict is still raging within themselves. So I guess I would compare VOD to the peaceless reconciliation that you talk about, in that it's, I guess, a restorative justice's own form of peaceless reconciliation. So that's how I understood your paper a little bit better. And I would be curious to know if, during your time there, if you found anything similar to any kind of mediation that was done within that particular context.
Thank you, Kelsey. And we'll give Professor Biletzki a chance to comment after we hear from Kate.
Hi, I'll also stay put here. Good morning, everyone. I also want to thank Professor Biletzki for her paper and sharing it with all of us. I really appreciated Kelsey's comments, because as she's speaking, it's making me rethink a lot of my ideas, and even areas where I think I had discomfort that actually kind of opened my eyes to some new things. This paper I thought was really challenging and forcing us to think about the way we conceive things and how we think about our timeline, I think in terms of conflict, and why we think about it that way, and how changing our timeline around can change everything. So it challenges a series of preconceived notions, most particularly, obviously, that reconciliation can only come in the aftermath of conflict. It asks us to consider the proposal that reconciliation is not dependent on the cessation of violence, but to the contrary, that reconciliation might actually be a necessary step in ending war itself. I thought about this a lot also in terms of alternative dispute resolution, but I don't have the experience that Kelsey has with the victim-offender dialogue. And I think that just really made me rethink things. I have more experience with mediation, and I was thinking about this in terms of mediation versus litigation, this paper, and the way that the timeline works for both of those. Obviously, in traditional litigation, we really can only conceive of peace after the conflict, after we've come out with a resolution, and throughout the process, it seems counterproductive for either one of the parties to be thinking about resolution or to be just, I guess, rethinking the way they're viewing the situation or looking at the other side's perspective. They can do that in the aftermath, and it's certainly encouraged in the aftermath. But mediation and other forms of alternative dispute resolution, so even arbitration, maybe less so than mediation, has a very different timeline. In order for mediation to come to fruition, we have to think about reaching, or not necessarily reaching peace, but certainly like looking at the other side's perspective and kind of reevaluating our take on the situation during the process in order to reach the desired result. So in that way, I was seeing a parallel between the approach offered here in mediation, but I had a little bit of discomfort because it didn't seem like it wasn't quite fitting for me. And that's why what Kelsey just said really made me think about this victim-offender dialogue fits more. And I want to, if I could just discuss the three factors that Biletzki talks about, the components of, or the proposed components of reconciliation. She discusses the recognition of asymmetry, the identification of victimhood, and the narrative of acknowledgement. And this is where, thinking about these, I wasn't seeing a direct parallel between these and mediation. Because especially with the recognition of asymmetry and the identification of victimhood, I think the author is asking us to do something very uncomfortable, admitting that the wrongdoing does not necessarily fall equally on the shoulders of the two parties. And I think that this is probably most often the case in any conflict, that probably there isn't necessarily a perfectly equal share of fault. But in approaching a mediation, that's a really tricky or a tricky issue. You don't want the parties to feel as if one is more at fault. And this is where I wasn't seeing a direct parallel. I wanted to think about this in terms of mediation because it's something that I understand and have experience with. But I was thinking this, it doesn't quite work here in the way that it does work with the victim-offender dialogue, where with the victim-offender dialogue, there is an imbalance. One person was victimized, probably more so, and acknowledging that is absolutely essential. Whereas in mediation, I think on one hand, it is essential to recognize that the parties might not be equally at fault, but you also don't want to place blame, and you don't want the parties to feel as if they're being treated differently. So I really, really appreciate you sharing that, Kelsey, because I think these are, in thinking about different ways to kind of conceive of this topic and like different lenses to see it through, we just can gain more of an understanding. And for me, where this is such a powerful idea, thinking about it in terms of something we understand allows us to think about how we can really put it into action. So I discussed the first two categories. The third category is where I really had questions when Professor Biletzki talks about, the narrative of acknowledgement. This was just really fascinating to me because I wondered how much that is asking, especially in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and talking about acknowledging things in a public forum. Professor, you spoke about in your paper the political implications of that, and that it can be a really scary thing to acknowledge something in a political forum. And that's just something I wanted to hear more about, and how much does it take when you've been kind of indoctrinated with certain stories for your entire life to rethink those? And it's one thing to think about that in terms of a mediation, where maybe the parties have several years of stories, basically, that you can kind of put on the table and work through. But when you're talking about decades and centuries, it's a whole different arena. So that was just fascinating. I'm eager to hear more. But thank you again.
I want to thank our commentators first. So we have about 5 minutes before we're going to take our break. We're exactly 15 minutes behind, so we will stay on track with respect to that. Professor Biletzki, is there any burning comment you'd like to make now or before we see if there are any questions?
30 seconds.
Sure.
I'd rather hear questions. First of all, thank you to both of you, because I really got an answer why the peace negotiations aren't going to work, but maybe something else will. In other words, we're going to put up a big flag now, VOD, rather than mediation, because what we've been working on has been mediation of the very classical type, and that's what the peace negotiations are supposed to be. With all the things that you underlined as not working, or as being different. So maybe we do have to think differently. And thanks, that kind of legal format, I trust the negotiators to think of something like that. I was really touched by what you said, Annabel, about social justice needs to be parallel to restorative justice. And that I didn't touch enough, and I really should talk in a different context about human rights, because I think of working at this through the human rights prism as furthering the social justice aspect rather than just the restorative aspect. And finally, the New Yorker just 2 weeks ago, I shouldn't confuse those two. The New Yorker 2 weeks ago had an article by Ari Shavit, who is basically Israel's Tom Friedman. You can see what I think of both of them. But had an article by Ari Shavit saying, yes, we perpetrated the Nakba. I'm not even sure that he used the word Nakba, but he said, yes, we massacred, we engaged in ethnic cleansing. We were terrible, but there was nothing else to do. And this relates to what all of you said. There's a difference, I think, between moral responsibility, legal responsibility, and political responsibility, and you all brought that up. So he might have taken a bit of moral responsibility upon himself, but we call it in Israel, yorim v'bochim, shooting and crying. You shoot and then you cry about it. And that's what it was, where I think legal and political responsibility has to move you forward. And I can only talk about moral responsibility.
Great. So we have time for one or two questions and or comments from the audience, and then we'll take our break. Is there anybody who'd like to comment now? Yes, hi.
My name is Julie Goldstein-Graham. I'm shaking from listening to Professor Biletzki's opinion. First of all, let me just introduce myself as an alumni of the law school. And born in Germany as a displaced person, of Holocaust survivors who lost everybody and who waited in Germany until 1949 to find a country that would accept us to go. And having been a student at Hebrew University in Jerusalem from 1968 to 69, when for the first time in my life I learned that there were Jews in the North African countries who had been once there was in Israel, the Israelis went into Morocco and to Yemen and into Libya and into Algeria and into Russia, into Ethiopia, and took those victims of a Holocaust, of genocide, to a country where they would be safe. And to hear you call us offenders, and you were going to be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize, I am shaking, literally shaking, from the hate-mongering that I'm hearing in here.
Professor Biletzki, I'm sure that you hear these kinds of responses as you talked about what you deal with, the very heartfelt and emotional and true response.
How can a victim suddenly become the offender? And while I was in law school, I was the founder of the Jewish Law Society, and one of the speakers that came to speak at the University of Bridgeport was from the Israeli Consulate, Department of Education, and he was a U.S.-Israeli attorney, and the topic was human rights and military law in Israel. Israel assumed, not Jewish law, not Talmudic law, but the law of Britain, which was governing the area prior to Israeli independence. And it was the practice of British law that they used we asked him about, why do you blow up houses of Palestinians? He explained that we're following British procedure. So,
Well, I can feel the sincerity of your reaction, and I'm sure that Professor Biletzki has made a lifetime of trying to reconcile the very strong emotions on both sides. So would you be able to, in the short time we have, excuse me, Shuli, we're going to give Professor Biletzki a chance to respond and perhaps demonstrate how you have this dialogue here in Israel and anywhere else with such strong emotion on both sides.
Thank you. I, first of all, am very, very sorry if anything I said offended you personally or as a representative of a group. In both ways, I do not mean to offend or to hurt anybody. That these things are hurtful and offensive is a given. I am offending my own group in a sense. And I don't want to go into factual argument, even though facts are the one thing that we should argue about, as opposed to the saying that gentlemen don't argue about facts. It is exactly the facts that we are arguing about. But I don't want to start that argument. I want to go back to what you said about being a survivor of the Holocaust and say that in Israel, what I use as my guiding light as to what we should be doing comes exactly from the Holocaust and from that mantra, and I say mantra positively here, from the Holocaust, never again. I distinguish between Israelis who say, never again will this happen to us. They are the ones who have set us on the wrong path. And those who say, never again will this happen to anyone. I find that as the only guiding light we can have. And I think that because Israelis have adopted never again will this happen to us, we have permitted ourselves, yes, to move from being victims to being the offenders. I think that is our greatest tragedy.
Thank you. I think if anybody has other questions, we please do save them for our final part of the day, when we will invite our speakers to come back and answer any additional questions. But let's take our 15-minute break. No? Do you want to? Linda Meyer, who invented this program, can do whatever she wishes. So if you have to pee, you have to blame her. Linda Meyer is going to speak now, and then we will take our break. No, I'm kidding.
There's a parallel story that was recently in the paper in Connecticut about a parole hearing for a female offender who had been in prison for 27 years. And she came up on parole, and the story that was told at her parole hearing was about how she had been raped as a child and abused and neglected, lots of domestic violence in her background. She had then taken to carrying a gun for protection. And after a confrontation with a man, she took out the gun and shot. She didn't hit the man who was confronting her. She hit a pregnant woman. And so, hence the sentence of 20. She had a 45-year sentence. She came up for parole after 27 years, and they told this very tragic tale about her background. And the pregnant woman's daughter got up and said, I don't want anyone to forget that my mother is the real victim here. And so this difficulty about who's the real victim, I think, is one that we're going to struggle with all day long.
Great, thanks. We'll see you back here at 10:15, or 10:20, sorry.